Almost nobody knows this part of Deborah's story, the part that made it into the county news, the aquifer, the drought, the woman who lived in a cave and found the water supply that saved Tulsa County. That part got around. Not widely, because "local woman identifies undiscovered aquifer" is not the kind of headline that travels far, but around enough that people in the area know the general shape of it. Deborah found water. The county drilled. The drought got managed. Good story. Next. What almost nobody talks about is the winter itself. The part before the discovery meant anything. The part where she was just a 53-year-old fat widow living alone in a limestone cave in rural Oklahoma, filling composition notebooks by flashlight, operating on borrowed methodology and her own desperate attention, with no reason to believe that what she was doing mattered to anyone. What almost nobody talks about is Randy's handwriting. See, the notebooks she used weren't blank. She'd taken her late husband's fishing journals with her when she left the house, partly because they were useful, partly for a reason she's never quite articulated out loud, but that I think I understand. Randy had mapped his fishing spots in those notebooks with an obsessive precision that was his particular way of making sense of the world. The grid coordinates, the depth estimates, the careful annotations in the margins, little notes to himself about conditions, about what he'd tried that worked and what hadn't. All of it in Randy's specific handwriting, which was cramped and tilted slightly to the right, and which she'd been reading for 29 years. She started filling in the blank pages with her own observations, Randy's old entries on one side of the page, her new ones continuing from where his left off. His handwriting and hers, in the same notebooks, working through the same methodical attention toward completely different problems. I want to tell you about that winter, and about what she actually found inside those caves, and about the walk from rock bottom to what came after. Because the headlines skip over the part that matters most. If you want the story nobody's bothering to tell, subscribe now. What I do here is go deep into the places the quick version misses, and this one has layers. Let me start where it was actually the worst. Not the porch, not the word they said, though we'll get there. The worst was the 3 weeks after the bank notice, before she made the decision about the cave. Those 3 weeks where she was still in the house, still surrounded by Randy's things, still trying to organize the financial rubble into something that might be manageable, still operating on the assumption that there was a way to stay if she could only find the right angle. There wasn't. She knew that. But knowing something and accepting it are different processes that don't always run on the same schedule. She'd call her daughter on Sundays. Her daughter, Emily, in Portland, with a good job and a partner Deborah liked, and a life that had sensibly located itself far from Oklahoma, would ask how things were going, and Deborah would say fine in the specific way that means not fine, but I don't want to have that conversation right now. Emily knew. Deborah knew Emily knew. They'd been doing this particular dance since Randy died, with the shared unspoken understanding that when Deborah was ready to say more, she would. She wasn't ready. She didn't know how to be ready. Admitting the full scope of it to Emily felt like making it real in a way that she could still avoid if she kept the calls at the level of fine. The nights were the hardest. Days you can fill. Days have tasks, have the performance of functionality, have things to look at and deal with and respond to that take up the space where the harder thoughts live. Nights don't work like that. Nights are when the harder thoughts move in and start talking. She'd lie in the bed she'd shared with Randy for 28 years and look at the ceiling and do the accounting. Not the financial accounting. She'd done that until there was nothing new to find. The other accounting. The one where you add up what's left and see if it's enough to build a future from. The kind of accounting that doesn't have a clear methodology, and that always risks going in directions you don't want it to go. She let it go in those directions, because she'd also learned in her life that the directions you don't let yourself go in tend to show up anyway, just through different doors and at worse times. She lay there and thought about what she had. The house, not hers to keep. The savings, depleted. The career, she'd never had one exactly, had always worked in pieces, in bookkeeping and part-time and flexible arrangements that had served her life structure well and left her with nothing that transferred to a resume. The network? Sparse. The neighbors, as it turned out, less present than she'd believed. What she had? 2 good hands, a careful mind, Randy's fishing journals, the worthless backland with the cave that everyone agreed was worthless. She got up at 3 in the morning and went to look at it. She'd been in the cave before, 3 times over the years briefly, mostly to retrieve something Randy had stored there. She'd never stayed long enough to understand it. That night, she stayed. She brought a flashlight. She brought a blanket. She brought one of Randy's notebooks and a pen, and she sat in the main chamber of that cave for 4 hours while the night went on outside and the limestone held its temperature around her, and the darkness was specific and real and oddly easier to be in than the bed and the ceiling and the accounting. What she noticed first was the temperature. Not just that it was constant, she knew limestone caves ran cold, but that it was a specific constant. Not the fluctuating cold of the outdoors, not the variable cold of a badly insulated house. A settled, reliable, specific temperature that her body calibrated to within about 20 minutes and then stopped fighting. 55 degrees, roughly. She noted it in the notebook. Then she started noticing the rest. The way the air moved through the cave. There were passages she hadn't explored, and the air that came from them had different qualities. The south passage was drier and had a slight warmth to it at certain times. The north passage had a coolness that was a degree or 2 below the main chamber. The east passage, the one she'd never gone into because it required crawling and she hadn't been motivated, had an air quality that was different from both. Heavier, more mineralized, with a smell she couldn't name but could note. Mineral, cold, pressured. She opened Randy's notebook to a blank page. She wrote, "Cave Inventory, Initial." She dated it. She started writing down what she was seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling. She used his system, his grid method, the shorthand he'd developed for his fishing spots, but applied it to the cave's passages and chambers. It felt right to use it. It felt like a conversation that could continue even though he couldn't. By the time she came out at dawn, her mind had done something she hadn't felt it do in months. It had settled. Not because the problems had resolved, not because anything had changed, but because she'd given it a problem that was specific and tractable, and that responded to careful attention. The cave had properties. Those properties could be documented. The documentation might lead somewhere, or it might not. But it was real work, methodical work, the kind of work that her mind was built for. She went back to the house, packed 2 trash bags, and moved into the cave the following Thursday. The first month was about learning to live in a cave. This sounds primitive. It was, in some ways. In others, it was a specific technical challenge that required the same methodical approach she was bringing to everything else. Where did moisture accumulate, and how did that affect storage? Which sections of the ceiling were stable and which needed monitoring? Where were the warmest sleeping spots and why? What was it about the rock composition or the air circulation that made those spots warmer? How did she manage light, food, water, hygiene, in a space with none of the infrastructure those things usually depend on? She figured it out systematically. She made mistakes. Early on, she stored food in a section of the cave that turned out to have too much moisture, and she lost several days' worth of provisions to mold. She noted it. She adjusted. She didn't make that mistake again, and she made sure to understand why the moisture was there so she could predict it in other sections. The composition notebooks filled up faster than she expected. She'd brought 8 of Randy's, the ones that still had blank pages in them, and she was through 3 of them by the end of the first month. Then she started her own, bought at the county library's small gift shop on one of her resupply runs into town. They weren't the same as Randy's. She noticed that every time she opened one. She also started going deeper. The east passage that she'd noted in the first night's inventory, the one with the pressured mineral smell, had been bothering her in the way that unresolved data bothers a careful mind. She documented it from the entrance but hadn't gone in. Now she went in. The passage narrowed and required crawling for about 30 feet. She'd assessed it on multiple occasions before going in, checking the ceiling stability, the floor conditions, the air quality at the entrance. When she finally committed to crawling through, she took her time. No rushing, no panic if she felt discomfort. The specific deliberateness of someone who understands that careful is not the same as slow, and that being in the right state of mind before doing something difficult matters. What she found at the end of the crawl was a chamber. She sat in that chamber for a long time, by flashlight, saying nothing, letting the sensory information accumulate before she started interpreting it. The mineral smell was intense here, the most intense she'd encountered. The walls had formations she'd never seen in the main chambers. The air itself felt heavier, denser, in a way she'd need to think about. And when she pressed her palm flat against the east wall of that chamber and held it there without moving, something, very faint, a vibration that might have been the rock moving in some geological process she didn't understand, or might have been something else. She stayed in that chamber for 3 hours. Then she crawled back out and sat in the passage for a while, breathing, thinking. Then she opened a notebook and started writing. Not conclusions. She never jumped to conclusions, but observations. Everything she'd seen and heard and smelled and felt. Everything that was there, exactly as it was, without interpretation yet. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she went to sleep. Here's the thing about Randy's fishing methodology that Deborah never fully told people, because it seemed like too small a thing to mention in the context of aquifers and droughts and county water authorities. Randy's notebooks weren't just maps. They were arguments. Each entry was implicitly arguing for a connection between conditions and outcomes, between water temperature and fish behavior, between depth and fish species, between time of year and optimal location. He wasn't just recording data. He was building a model of how this specific system worked, built from the ground up through repeated observation rather than from theory down. Deborah understood this because she'd watched him build it over years, and because she'd had conversations with him about it that he'd probably forgotten, but that she'd filed away in the way she filed everything. The model wasn't written down explicitly. It was distributed across hundreds of entries, implicit in the patterns, available to anyone who read enough of them carefully enough to see the structure. She read them carefully enough. She saw the structure, and then she applied it to the cave. Not the content. Fish behavior has nothing to do with aquifer geology, but the methodology, the way of building a model of a specific system from the ground up, entry by entry, observation by observation, until the pattern became visible. The understanding that a system has internal logic that can be discovered by paying close enough attention over long enough time. The patience required to keep observing, even when what you're observing doesn't immediately make sense. This is what she brought to the cave's geological properties that the county's geologists hadn't brought, because the county's geologists hadn't spent a winter living in the cave. They had equipment she didn't have. They had training she didn't have. What she had that they didn't have was months of continuous daily close-range attention to one specific system. And attention, it turns out, is not replaceable by equipment. It's complementary to it. The two together produce something that neither produces alone. She knew where the water was because she'd been listening to the same walls for 6 months. Equipment confirmed what attention had already found. That's the honest account of what happened, and it's more interesting to me than the version where she's just a surprisingly smart person who stumbled into the right place. She wasn't stumbling. She was walking very carefully, using borrowed methodology, following the data wherever it led, in the notebook margins alongside Randy's cramped handwriting, in a cave that everyone had agreed was worthless. She'd been in the cave for 5 months when the drought became impossible to ignore. By then, she had a rhythm. Supply run into town every 2 weeks, the library for books and the computer, the grocery store for what she could carry back, the hardware store occasionally for small materials. She listened to the radio every night. She tracked the drought coverage the way she tracked everything, with attention to what was being said and what wasn't, to the gap between official language and actual conditions. The gap was widening. She'd been noting the aquifer in her own mind, never quite calling it that, always keeping the language tentative, never letting the word carry more weight than the evidence supported, since that first night in the Eastern Chamber. Over the months, the evidence had accumulated. More visits to that chamber, each one adding data, cross-referencing with a geological survey map she'd found in the library and with technical texts she'd requested through interlibrary loan, and which had arrived looking optimistic and turned out to be genuinely useful. The technical vocabulary helped her understand what she was seeing. What she'd been interpreting through smell and sound and feel now had names. The formations were specific and consistent with a pattern she could look up. The pressure she'd felt in the east wall had an explanation that pointed to something behind it. The depth she estimated, using acoustic methods she'd developed herself, tapping different sections of rock and timing the responses, aligned with what the geological survey said should be there. She was not certain. She was careful about certainty. But she was moving from possibly to probably to very probably with each new piece of data. And the county was running out of water. She wrote the letter to the Water Authority on a Wednesday morning at the library. She used the formal register, careful, specific, technical where she could be technical, precisely hedged where she needed to hedge. She described her methodology in enough detail that a professional could evaluate it. She gave the coordinates. She gave the depth estimate and the reasoning behind it. She attached a summary of her observations, organized chronologically. She mailed it certified mail so she'd know when it was received. She went back to the cave, continued working, did not wait. The response from the Water Authority came 14 days after they'd received the letter. She knew the date of receipt because of the certified mail tracking. The response was a form letter with a personal sentence added at the top. Thank you for your submission. We receive many community tips and appreciate your engagement with this important issue. Signed by someone in communications. She'd expected this. She'd known when she wrote the letter that the probability of it being taken seriously immediately was low. Not zero, she'd written it anyway, but low. She understood the gap between what she was claiming and what would make it credible to the people she was claiming it to. She called the Water Authority's technical line the following Monday. She reached a man who was polite in the way of people whose job is to handle the calls that come to the technical line rather than the main number. She explained briefly what she'd found and why she believed it was credible. He took notes. He said someone would review her submission. No one called. She called back 2 weeks later. Different person. Same politeness. Same non-commitment. This time she asked specifically whether there was a geologist on staff who could speak with her, and was told that those staff members didn't typically take calls, but that her concerns would be forwarded. She started writing a more detailed document. Not a letter, a technical report. As close to the format of a professional geological assessment as she could make it, using the vocabulary she'd acquired from the technical texts and the library research, organized with the care she brought to everything. She checked it against what she could find online about the format of such documents. She revised it twice. She printed it and read it aloud to check for errors, sitting in the cave with the flashlight, her voice slightly odd in the contained acoustic space of the limestone. She sent it to 3 people at the county, the Water Authority director, the county engineer, and, on a hunch, the chair of the County Emergency Management Committee. Then she went back to work. Linda Garza called on a Thursday afternoon. The call came to the library phone because Deborah had listed the library number as her contact. It was the number where she could most reliably be reached, and she'd made a standing arrangement with the librarian to take messages and to flag calls from specific entities. She was in the middle of returning books when the librarian said someone from a geological consulting firm was on the line. She sat down. She took the call. Linda was direct in the way of people who value other people's time and assume they value their own. She'd received Deborah's report, the most recent one, the detailed one, from the Emergency Management Committee chair, who'd passed it along when he couldn't make sense of it himself, but had recognized that it wasn't obviously ignorable. Linda had read it. She had questions. Could Deborah meet her at the site? Deborah said yes. They arranged it for Saturday. Linda arrived with a truck and equipment, and the practical efficiency of someone who spends most of her working life in the field. She was perhaps 10 years younger than Deborah, compact and precise in her movements, with the quality of attention that Deborah recognized because it was her own quality, the kind of attention that takes things in and processes them before deciding what to say about them. They went into the cave. Linda didn't say much for the first 2 hours. She took her own measurements, ran her own instruments, conducted her own observations of the same systems that Deborah had been observing for months. Occasionally she asked a clarifying question. What had Deborah meant by this notation? How had she estimated this figure? What was the basis for this conclusion? The questions were specific and technical. Deborah answered them the same way. At one point, deep in the eastern passage, Linda pressed her own hand against the wall of the chamber and held it. Deborah watched her do it. Neither of them spoke for a while. "You've been in here daily?" Linda asked finally. "Most days. At least every other day." A pause. "For how long?" 6 months. Since February." Linda looked at the notebook pages Deborah had shown her. The accumulation of entries, the system, the methodology borrowed from a dead man's fishing journals and adapted to limestone geology. She didn't say anything about that either. What she said eventually, when they came back to the main chamber: "I need to run a proper survey. I'm going to bring equipment on Monday. I want you to walk me through your full documentation." That was all. But the way she said it, the specific quality of seriousness in a geologist who has just encountered data that warrants serious attention, told Deborah what she needed to know. There's a version of this story, the version that the people who ended up knowing about it tended to tell, where Deborah's vindication was the point, where the aquifer was a kind of cosmic justice served to the people who'd called her useless, where the ending corrected the beginning, clean arc, moral, neatly delivered. That's not the version Deborah tells. When she talks about it at all, and she's selective about when and to whom, because she's still the same person who doesn't take up social space unnecessarily, she talks about the work, the specific decisions she made during the months in the cave, why she chose to use Randy's grid system instead of something else, what the mineral smell actually told her about the geology and how long it took to understand what it was telling her, the specific technical challenge of developing an acoustic analysis method without equipment, the hours of tapping on rock and the patterns in the timing, the way she developed a mental baseline over weeks and then read variations against that baseline. The process. She talks about the process because the process is what was real to her while it was happening. The vindication came after. The process was now. And I think that's the thing that's hardest to communicate about people who do serious work, the way the work itself becomes the primary experience, while everything else becomes context. While she was in the cave mapping the aquifer, she was not simultaneously having an experience of proving the Elm Creek Road neighbors wrong. She was just mapping. She was just paying attention. The accounting she'd done those long nights in the house, the accounting of what was left and whether it was enough, got replaced, in the cave, by a different kind of accounting, one that responded to observation rather than only to loss. That shift was not nothing. It was, arguably, everything. The confirmation took 3 days. Linda came back Monday with a team and equipment that did in hours what Deborah had been doing over months, confirming the same things, reaching the same conclusions, but now with professional instruments and peer-reviewable methodology rather than a borrowed system and a flashlight. The aquifer was real. It was large. The drill site was exactly where Deborah had marked it. The county drilled. The water came up. The crisis that had been quietly escalating behind official language. The reservoirs at 31%. The contaminated backup source. The water management protocols that assumed alternatives they didn't have. Got managed. Not without difficulty, not instantly, not without a set of policy conversations that are still ongoing. But the water that Deborah found became part of the county's resource base, and the drought that year was addressed without the rationing levels that had been quietly feared. Deborah was mentioned in Linda's professional report as the original identifier of the site, not by name, at her request. She didn't want her name in it. She wanted the aquifer to be about the aquifer, not about her. She moved out of the cave in April, when the income from the consulting process gave her enough to rent a small place nearby. She took the composition notebooks with her, all of them, Randy's, with his handwriting in the margins, and hers, with hers alongside it. She goes back to the cave sometimes, not to map it anymore, but to sit in it, in the temperature, which is still 55 degrees, exactly as it always was, exactly as it always will be, regardless of what happens above ground. There's something steadying about that. She said so. Emily visited the summer after the drought. They sat on the porch of the rental house on a July evening, and Deborah told her most of it. Not all of it. Some of it she's still organizing in her own mind, still finding the language for. Emily listened without interrupting, which is her particular gift. And when Deborah finished, she said, "I wish you'd told me." And Deborah said, "I know. I wasn't ready." And that was true, and was enough. Here's the sentence that gets me every time I think about Deborah's story. The aquifer was there the whole time, not because of Deborah. It was there before she was born, before Randy was born, before the county was incorporated, before the land was parceled and sold and written off and sold again. The water was in the ground doing what water does in the ground, existing, moving, waiting for the conditions that would make it accessible. It wasn't waiting for Deborah specifically. It wasn't waiting for anyone. But here's the thing. The aquifer being there was necessary but not sufficient. The aquifer being there meant the water was available in principle. It didn't mean anyone knew where it was. It didn't mean anyone would find it. The gap between the water existing and the water being usable was the gap that Deborah crossed, by accident of circumstance and by specific application of a borrowed methodology in a cave that everyone agreed was worthless. And I keep thinking about what made the crossing possible. It wasn't just intelligence. Linda Garza has more geological training than Deborah, and Linda hadn't found it. It wasn't just determination. The county had people with determination working on the water problem, and they hadn't found it either. It was the combination of being in the right place for the right duration, paying the right kind of attention. It was months of daily presence in a specific system, long enough for the pattern to reveal itself. It was the fishing spot methodology applied to limestone geology by a woman who happened to have access to both because of who her husband had been and what he'd left behind. It was Randy's handwriting in the notebook margins. It was the word useless on the porch of a house she no longer lives in. It was the bank notice on a door she no longer opens. All of it, all the worst of it, was part of the mechanism that put her in the cave with the flashlight and the notebook, paying attention to the walls. And I don't say this to tell you that suffering is secretly a gift, or that the people who hurt her were actually doing her a favor. They weren't. The harm was real. The loss was real. The coldness of that winter in the cave was real, but also real. What she found there, what she built from what she had, what she did with the borrowed system and the blank pages and the months of attention that nobody asked her to pay and nobody rewarded her for paying. The notebook she started in the cave still has Randy's entries in the front. His handwriting, cramped and tilted slightly right. Fishing spots, depth estimates, notes to himself about conditions, and then her handwriting starting where the blank pages began. Same methodology, different problem. Both of them, somehow, in the same notebook. I think that's the thing I'd want you to take from this. Not the aquifer, not the drought, not the redemption arc or the vindication or any of the things that make it into a story worth telling at the level of headlines. The notebook, the decision to keep going, the attention that kept being paid even when nobody was watching and nobody was asking, and the temperature outside was February in Oklahoma, and the word they'd left ringing was useless. That attention found the water. It always does.